Let's talk about constructors. So, as the name suggests, constructors are used to construct something. In the concept of Java, in the context of Java, constructors are basically used to construct objects of a particular class. So, if I have, let's say, a class and I want to create objects that are specific to that class, I have to use constructors. You might have noticed the use of constructors while creating objects. So let's say I have a class called vehicle and I want to create an object called car. So what do I write? I say vehicle car is equal to new vehicle, right? And then I use this and this bracket. Sorry, yeah, I say new and then vehicle, opening and closing brackets. So here, this one here with the brackets is called constructor. So what is this constructor? As you might have noticed, constructor is written in the form of a function. So just like a normal Java method, we define here the constructor called vehicle. Do we pass any arguments inside? No. So since we don't pass any arguments, it is called a default constructor. We might pass arguments according to our use, but here we are not passing any argument. So constructors are basically special methods inside a Java code which are used specifically for creating objects out of a class, and they have the same name as the class name and they don't have any return type. Okay, so these are member methods of a class which has the same name as the class, has no return type, and is used to initialize the instance variables of a class with a legal initial value, and it gets involved and invoked immediately on object creation. Okay, so that's the basic thing about constructors. Now there's a certain need to a constructor. Why there is this need of creating a constructor? So constructors are basically used for one, to create objects out of a class, and second, constructors are also used to initialize the objects of a class type with a legal initial value. Now what do I mean by legal initial value? So for example, I have a class and I want to initialize certain values with certain numbers that I actually know. So for example, let's say I want to create a class and I want to initialize the minimum value to be 0 and the maximum value to be 0 as well. And now while I run through the main part of the main function of the class, I want to find out the min and the max number. So what I can do is I can initialize this min and max to be 0 inside this constructor, and eventually when I write the main function, I can use the values of min and max which were defined in the initial constructor inside the main function. So that is one way of using a constructor. Now how do I invoke a constructor? Invoking a constructor is basically done while we are creating an object of a class. So whenever we call a constructor, we do it with the class name and we follow it with the brackets. See here, it is getting invoked, and this is a default constructor. Why? Because it doesn't have any arguments specified within it. Now a constructor is always defined as public. And why is it so? Constructor should be defined as public within the section of a class so that the object can be created from any method, in any method, using that constructor. And constructors might be called from outside the class as well while creating an object. So we always utilize constructors to be public. We always initialize them to be public. So constructors are always public. They are used for creating objects, that's why, and they can be invoked while a class is called from another class. So that's the reason constructors are defined as public. So there are certain differences that occur between constructors and methods. One of the significant differences is constructors usually have the same name as the class name. So I'll just define the differences. So this is constructor, this is function. So constructor has the same name as class, and function can have any name other than class name. Right, so this is one difference. Another difference is that constructors are usually public, and these can be public, private, protected, correct? So it can be having any access specifier. Apart from that, there are also some differences, like constructor has no return type, and functions can have any return type depending on the function. Okay, and constructors are called at the time of object creation and don't require to be called from the main class. So constructors don't necessarily need to be called from the main class. Constructors are invoked automatically while class creation. While functions have to be invoked physically, we have to specifically call that function name inside the main class in order to call it. Otherwise, it won't get invoked at all. While constructors, they are automatically called when the class is created. So that's one difference. That's one significant difference between constructors and functions. And constructors are basically used for initializing the instance variables of a class, while functions are specifically used to perform certain instructions within the code. So this is the major difference. These are the major differences between constructors and methods. Now let's learn something more about constructors. There are basically three types of constructor types. So one is default constructor, one is parameterized constructor, and the third is copy constructor. Okay, so these are the various types of constructors. Now default constructor is also known as non-parameterized constructor. Why? Because there are no parameters involved. So parameters are basically the arguments. So since there are no arguments involved, let's say a class is defined as class student, and I want to create an object. So student OB is equal to new student. So in here, whenever I call this constructor, I don't specify any parameters or arguments within it. So this is also known as default constructor or non-parameterized because there are no parameters involved. Okay, so this is one. Another one is parameterized constructor when there are parameters involved. So let's say I write student OB is equal to new student, and let's say I specify the name, the role, and the section within this parameters list. So then we actually initialize the initial values of the name. Let's say I name the student as Ram, the role to be 21, and the section to be A. So I have defined a specific object of student class with the name Ram, role 21, and section A. So it is used to create an object of class student, and I have specified the specific parameters inside the constructor parameter list. So that is the use of parameterized constructor. Also, defining a constructor with arguments hides the default constructor. So when a parameterized constructor is used, one must provide the initial values as arguments, otherwise the compiler will report an error. So all the initial values must be declared within this parameterized constructor. And whenever a parameterized constructor is called, the default constructor gets overridden. Okay. Apart from that, there is one called copy constructor, and copy constructor is basically used to initialize the variables of an object by copying the initial values of the instance variables from another object. Okay, so for example, I have this class student, and I have created student ob1 is equal to new student. Okay, so suppose I created this and I wanted to create a separate object, so I name it as ob2. So then I can just directly do ob2 is equal to ob1, and this will create an object with the same parameters as of ob1, and that object will be named ob2. So this is known as copy constructor. Okay. Now, similar to function overloading, there is a concept in in constructors called constructor overloading. So it is the process of using a number of constructors, constructor overloading. So it is the process of using more than one constructors with the same name but having different parameter lists. Okay, the compiler differentiates these constructors by taking into account the number of parameters in the list and the type due to different signatures. So it's very similar to how function overloading occurs. Okay, and if a class generally contains more than one constructor, then they are automatically overloaded. Okay, so if there are more than one constructors, then it's automatically overloaded. Now there's another thing called this. Now this is basically a keyword which we'll be discussing in the last chapter, and that is gonna be the last part of this constructors video, and then we'll jump on to solving some questions regarding constructors. So that's the first part of constructors video. Thank you guys for watching. Till next time, bye bye.